So I think we're just going to start off this evening. I just want to start off by welcoming everyone. Thank you for joining us at Golden Key Wits' second day of the Graduating into a Global Recession and Pandemic Work Readiness week-long event. And today we're joined by Raj Naran to talk about virtual interviews, how to prepare for them, and how to conduct yourself during them. To tell you a bit about Raj, Raj is a team leader for the Career Services at CCDU, that is the Careers and Counseling Development Unit. He has had several years of experience running the Careers and Graduate Recruitment Program at Wits, and he has been at Wits for several years and has experience in skills training for students. He also took part in setting up the virtual careers fair this year, and today he is here to share his knowledge and expertise with us to help us prepare for this event. Please drop all your questions in the Q&A space, not the chat box, in the Q&A space, so that Mr. Naran can answer all your questions during the Q&A session. I'd just like to hand over the floor to Mr. Raj Naran. Welcome and thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you, and welcome to all the guests here. I was asked to talk about how best to deal with the virtual interview. And as I gave more thought to it, the whole idea of virtual interviews, it's not new, but its prevalence is certainly sort of knocked all of us over. We're not very familiar with how to deal with that. But as I gave more thought to it, what did occur to me is that the similarities between the virtual interview and the real interview are, there's quite a lot of overlap there. There's not that much of a difference. So what I'll do is go through a presentation that I had prepared on the job interview. And in so doing, I will also try and draw a reference to those areas where I think the virtual interview might need some special attention. So I'm going to start the presentation and we can take it from there and hopefully get to the Q&A session in good time. The job search process, I don't think this comes as any surprise. I'm going to start here, but generally one would submit an application which would include your CV, the cover letter, and sometimes you'd be asked to complete an application form or an online application. This hasn't really changed that much. There is a tendency, of course, to complete the online application, but the difference between these isn't that stark, and the information that you're required to impart is very similar. Some job search processes or recruitment processes may require the candidates to do an assessment and then, of course, attend a job interview or several interviews in some instances before the job interview is, before the job offer is negotiated. Let's just touch on base with some of the things that one would do before the interview. And this is the same whether it's an in-person interview or an online interview, a virtual interview. I do apologize for the noise outside. Unfortunately, I don't have terribly much control over the neighbors' dogs. So first of all, I think do ensure that your diary is clear. Don't let any other activity compete with the fact that you have to focus on the interview. It's an important event, and you do want to actually give the best that you've got to this interview. You don't want to be distracted. You want to be quite focused as you enter this interview. So do keep your space on the diary clear. It's a good idea to have your documents organized in a neat folder, similar to the way that you would if you were going to attend an in-person interview. So you do want to have a copy of your CV at hand in case one of the interview panel make a reference to it and you need to refer to it. You also want to have a copy of your cover letter, your academic transcripts, and perhaps any of the other documents that you might have submitted as part of the application process. Now, with the in-person interview, you'd obviously want to confirm the venue, arrange transport and parking. So if we're looking at the virtual interview here, your venue would be the app that's being used, whether it's Zoom, Microsoft Teams, Skype, or some other platform. And the idea is that you actually want to try and be as familiar with it as possible. So in the same way that you want to familiarize yourself with the venue, the physical venue of an in-person interview, you want to familiarize yourself with the app that's going to be used. You want to know, have a sense of what the protocol is, how the interaction is going to play out between you and the panel. And you also want to be very familiar with the idea of how the chat or the Q&A process works in the app, as well as the process of perhaps sharing a screen if you are asked to perhaps share a document. And most importantly, I think for the etiquette of the process, it's not a good idea for many people to speak in an interview, in a real in-person interview at the same time. And it can get more chaotic when you're doing a virtual interview. So do become familiar with the process of raising your hand and having the person chairing the session give you permission to actually speak or time to speak. Things can get very chaotic, and you can come across very badly if you're just going to be barging in on other people's conversation or other people's input all the time. So confirm that venue. In this case, it's going to be a case of getting familiar with the app, and you want to establish this before you even get anywhere near the interview. So ideally a day before the date of the interview. And if you can, I think you also want to perhaps do some mock interviews on this app. So organize a meeting with your friend, have them interview you over the app so that you actually are familiar with how it works and you're not fumbling around too much with the technology. You're able to focus with the interview, the questions that are being posed, and how you intend to respond to them. In the in-person interview, you're going to have an interview suit that you use or an interview outfit that's ready. Now, this isn't any less important. I mean, I've had some news of how counselors in New Zealand have been sitting in on virtual interviews without their pants on. I don't think it's going to get that bad. But you do want to look neat. You do want to look presentable. Your image, the way you present yourself is important. So you do want to have a reasonably good interview outfit. Or image that you're going to project or that others are going to see is generally going to be of your head and shoulders. You don't want to be too far from the camera so that they can't actually see the detail of your face, but also you don't want to be too close to the camera where they see too much detail, where perhaps your nose or your ears are emphasized in a way that's not realistic, and perhaps your face even distorted. So sit at a reasonable distance from the camera, and you do want to certainly look presentable, hair combed and neat, and certainly a reasonably smart outfit. You want to get onto the platform at least 15 to 20 minutes before the actual interview to see that your connection is working, that you are going to, that your access to the platform is in place, even though the meeting may not have started. So you do want to do a test run 15 to 20 minutes early, where in the in-person interview, you actually want to get to the venue 15 to 20 minutes before time. Here, you actually just want to test the platform to see that it's working and perhaps have it up and running 15 minutes or so before the actual interview starts so that you can ensure that everything is running smoothly. You do not want any distractions while you're being interviewed. So your mobile phone should ideally be switched off and perhaps not with you at the same time. And also you want to switch off email alerts because you don't want them popping up on the screen all the time. It's going to distract you and it's going to take away from your ability to focus on the actual interview. So once the interview has started, perhaps even before the interview has started, you're probably going to be dealing with quite a lot of anxiety. I don't think people are less anxious in the virtual interview than they might be in the in-person interview. So do expect that you're going to be a bit nervous, and there's nothing unusual about this. This is quite a normal thing. You're putting yourself on show. It's not an easy thing to do, and everybody is going to be dealing with anxiety. And one of the best tools that you could possibly have with you when you're dealing with anxiety is to always remind yourself to breathe. I think breathing helps to relax you. If you're running out of breath, your brain's going to get a sense that it's time to panic, and you don't want that to happen. So do remind yourself regularly throughout the interview to breathe whenever you need to. Allow the interview to take the lead and to direct you to to a point where you need to actually respond. So you do not want to speak all the time and interject others. You want somebody, and the interviewer should, or someone in the interview panel will probably give an indication of who is going to be chairing the session. And in the same way that you actually want to speak when you have a space to do so, you also want to, perhaps when you're not having to speak, you want to actually mute your microphone, because that way there'll be less background noise from your end in the interview conversation. Maintain a good upright position and good eye contact. This is quite important. So you do want to actually give a sense that your head and shoulders are being caught by the camera. You want to maintain good eye contact, whereas in the personal interview, in the in-person interview, you are going to be looking at the individual's eyes. What you need to do here is remember that what you need to maintain good eye contact with is the camera on your computer. So make sure that the camera is at a good enough angle that it captures your shoulders and your head at a good distance, and that you are speaking to the camera. You should actually see the camera as the interview panel and talk directly to the camera as far as possible. Remember to always allow the interviewer to finish the question before you answer. This is important, and it'll show that you're able to participate in a conversation, in a meeting, in quite a mature way, if you're able to actually manage that. It's not always easy, but do remember that somebody else is chairing this session, and that person will give you space to speak. A good interviewer will give you ample space to state your case or answer questions, because this is really what the purpose of the interview is. And if necessary, ask for clarity. And if you are muted and you need to ask a question, do raise your hand. That is the virtual hand that you will have access to in the app that you're using. In the physical interview, in the in-person interview, you're going to be distributing eye contact amongst all the interviewers, and this will not be possible here. So what you're going to be doing is looking at the camera. This is going to be the eyes, the camera is really going to be the eyes that you want to maintain good contact with. Much the same as with the in-person interview. One of the core questions that you're going to be having to deal with, that you're going to have to deal with, is the one that says, tell me about yourself. Now, this can be asked in a number of different ways. How would your best friend describe you? Tell me about yourself. How would you describe yourself? Tell me a little bit about your background, your history. And essentially, the question asks the same thing. It's usually an icebreaker question, so it's the first question that's asked in an interview. And dealing well with this question will obviously set a tone for your participation in the rest of the interview. It will make you feel more relaxed, and in many ways, if you're comfortable answering this question, it will also help the interviewer to feel relaxed. So what you want to include in this question is a bit about your personal background. You don't want to get too personal and reveal details that perhaps might be very painful for you to recollect. You want to actually make it superficial. So a sense of, I come from this place, I'm the first of 3 children, I'm the middle child, my parents are both professionals, they are unemployed, whatever the situation is, give an honest background, but you don't have to get too personal. You want to talk a little bit about your hobbies and interests, your biggest achievements, your career plans. This will give an idea that you do have goals and that you do have plans that you actually want to try and implement. You want to talk about your strongest personal attributes. And overall, the answer to this question should not take more than 2 minutes. And if you are working with your video on, and I would imagine that most interviews will ask you to have your camera on so that they can actually see you. This is going to be quite important. Do try and be aware of the body language of the interviewers. Ideally, they should be respectful of you in the same way that they would expect you to respect them. So they should be giving you your fullest attention. But if you do find that you are losing the interviewers, it could be that you're not answering the question or that you're actually talking for too long. So do be aware of that. Self-describing words. Try and get familiar with some of these self-describing words. Try and get comfortable with words that you would be easy using. The words don't have to be too fancy, but always remember that if you use a self-describing word such as industrial, industrious, or focused, this often is an opportunity for the interviewer to ask you, how have you demonstrated that you are industrious? Or can you perhaps give me an example of how you have been very focused when you've had to deal with a challenge? So everything you do say in the interview is an opportunity for a further question, and that's fine, because the more questions the interviewer asks you, the more interested they are in you. There are lots of lists of self-describing words on the internet, and I would advise you to use them in a discerning way. Use words that you're comfortable with, and use words that serve your purpose best. So do explore these. This is just one list, but there are many lists, and this is by no means a complete list. Some of the things that you would obviously need to pay attention to is the issue of self and career awareness. And this relates to your general understanding of what you are, what your strengths are, your weaknesses are, what your values are, and what your career goals are. So some of the questions that you might want to spend some time answering relate to the points that I've listed here on the screen. My strongest personal attributes are. So, for example, you can make reference to your interpersonal strengths, how you get on with people, what your particular strengths are in this regard, what your personality strengths are, your preferences, your dislikes. And I think you want to focus on your positive areas, but do be prepared that if you list positive, an interviewer may ask you, what do you think your personality weaknesses are? And you should be prepared to answer that. You could refer to academic strengths and technical strengths as well. You should be able to complete the statement, my education has prepared me for, so that you're looking at the positive things you've taken away from your education. My studies have been relevant for my career plans in that. My most developed skills are, and you can think of a few skills that relate to the job that you're applying for or to the organization that you're applying to. My weaknesses or areas for growth are, and here once again, you cannot say that you don't have weaknesses. Everybody has them. But I think you do want to give a sense of weaknesses perhaps that are fixable through some training or some experience. So you could relate, for example, to a program. Sorry about that. You could relate to a program. Okay, we've got silence again. Yeah, weaknesses. You could relate to, for example, a computer program that you're not familiar with that may need to be used in the job. This, of course, is something that's very fixable with a 2-week training course. The other weaknesses you can talk about are lack of experience, and this once again is fixable through the opportunity of experience. You don't want to refer to weaknesses that are very personal here, and the reason I say that is because when you refer to very painful aspects from your past or weaknesses that are very painful, they can leave you feeling very vulnerable in the interview situation and exposed. And this will distract you from actually being able to focus on what your strengths are. So always remember that when you talk about weaknesses, you don't want to get very personal, but they may perhaps ask you, what do you think your personal weaknesses are? And there, of course, it's a good idea to refer to something like, I think I'm a perfectionist. And if you show awareness of it, then I think it's also a good idea to show how you're dealing with it. So if you're aware of it, you may perhaps be dealing with it through training. You may perhaps even be attending a therapy process to deal with these kinds of issues that you're dealing with, because everyone has weaknesses. So being positive about it and showing that you're actually dealing with it in a non-defensive way is a good idea. You want to talk about your biggest achievements. I think that's what everybody wants to relate to. So always try and give a sense of what these achievements are and why you consider these to be your biggest achievements. For many students, I think just completing a university degree is a massively big achievement. Other points that you might want to consider are, for example, completing statements like, we have here, I consider myself a desirable candidate because. And if you notice the thread through all of these questions, they help you to describe yourself and to speak to your attributes. And this is really what the interview is about. It's about getting the candidate to talk about themselves so that they can be assessed in terms of suitability for a position. You could talk about what your biggest challenges in reaching your goals have been. And you also want to give an indication perhaps of how you try to overcome these challenges. You could talk about, you also want to have a sense of what your strengths are insofar as participating in a team is concerned. So here you could obviously do a search of for something like Belbin's team roles. And I think they do give a sense of how you should describe your strengths in a team, but do be mindful not to rattle off or rote learn, or simply repeat statements that have already been out there. Try to use your own words and let your personality come through here. But the team roles described by Belbin would give you some material with which to describe your strengths and perhaps your challenges in a team situation. In the same way, you want to look at what your leadership attributes are. And when it comes to strengths in a team or leadership attributes, yes, it's good to sound positive, but remember, nobody scores 10 out of 10 in any of these. So if you do have some gaps, that's fine. Try and think of one or two strengths that you have that you actually want to highlight. That's the purpose of your job in this interview process. Answer the question, if you were one of two people shortlisted for this position, why should this position be offered to you? And once again, this relates very much to the question, tell me about yourself. You want to give a summary of what your strengths are, and that's really what it is. And particularly your strengths in relation to the job or the organization to which you are applying. You will be expected to have some questions for the interviewer or the interviewers. And it's not a good idea to end an a job interview without having any questions for the panel. And some of the questions you could ask, and this list is by no means complete, but some of the questions you could refer to are questions like, what is the company's policy regarding training and development of employees? What is the management structure of the department in which I will be working? What would you describe as the company's strongest values? And some of these can be quite tricky as well, because an interviewer could quite easily turn a question like this around. If you, for example, ask, what would you describe as the company's strongest values? They could say, what has your research into the company told you about our values? And the ball's back in your court. But there's nothing wrong with that. The idea is that they actually want to hear you describe yourself, and they would like you to talk as much as possible. And the more questions they ask you, of course, the more interested they are in you. What characteristics do you look for in employers in order to represent those values? And a question you could throw at them that might perhaps get them thinking is, what do you value about working for this company? And that might perhaps embarrass some of the interviewers who perhaps are not very happy in their jobs, but their job is to obviously portray the company in as possible way, in as positive a way as possible. This template here, key areas for observation, this is actually a very useful template with which to answer questions in an interview. And what you'll find that a lot of the points on which you are being observed in an interview relate to communication and intellect, problem solving, leadership, teamwork, conflict management, and of course, time and stress management. Now, nobody's going to ask you questions about how you communicate or what your intellectual strengths are, but they will try and gauge that from how you answer questions, how you organize the information that you provide in your answer to these questions. And with regard to the other elements that are listed there, problem solving, leadership, teamwork, etc., you may perhaps be required to give an example of a time when you, for example, solved a problem, or where you've demonstrated some leadership skill or demonstrated your teamwork strengths. And what I often ask students to do is use what's called the STAR formula. And this is a wonderful template to use in a situation like an interview where you are under a lot of stress and you want to obviously try and make the best of the situation. So I recommend that they use what I call the STAR formula. And the STAR formula literally works this way. You describe a situation, and then you outline the tasks that needed to be performed. You talk the panel through the action steps, and you summarize with a result. Sometimes the result isn't a positive one, but if you can indicate strong learn that you've taken out of that situation, you've done justice to the question that was posed to you. I think you should ideally have at least 2 examples in each of these areas here: problem solving, leadership, teamwork, conflict management, and time and stress management that you can relate to. And the reason I say 2 examples is that very often I pose a question to a student in a mock interview, for example, and they give me such a well-rehearsed answer that I can't actually fault them on that. But then I ask them for another example, and that often floors them. They struggle to actually think. And this isn't really about embarrassing the interviewee. It's really about getting a sense of how they deal with a stressful situation. So 2 examples is usually a good idea. And as I've said with the earlier in this presentation, try not to rote learn answers. Try to use your ability to speak and to communicate. And with more experience, you will obviously strengthen those abilities. But rote learned answers can be very problematic. And one of the biggest problems there is that the student or the candidate can be asked a question in a slightly different way, and because you have rote learned answer, you provide that rote learned answer, which isn't always the appropriate answer or the relevant answer. So do always listen to the question before you answer. So some more specific pointers here for the online interview. Before the interview, I think you do want a secluded space. I know that I haven't done justice to that in this presentation, but try and find the most secluded space that you can. Ideally, you don't want people with you because they're going to be a distraction. So I think you want to be able to focus on the interviewer and or the interviewers and what they are asking you and what they expect you to respond to. So that's very important, a secluded space with minimal background noise. You want to have stable internet connection, and this ideally can be at another place as well if you feel that your internet connection at home isn't strong enough. You do not want to have a very broken internet connection, but I think an interviewer would generally understand that you don't always have control over this kind of thing. But do try and offer the best internet connection that you can have access to. Make sure that your device is in a stable and well-placed position. It's not a good idea to have your computer or your phone in your hand as you move around. Remember, this picture or this image is going to jump around, and it's not going to make a very good impression. Moreover, it's going to be a distraction because you're constantly going to be focusing on looking at the camera and moving it around. So whether it's your phone or computer, ideally have it placed on a table or a desk and have a stable chair in front of it so that you can adjust the screen to a suitable angle, and know that the computer and the device doesn't have to be worried about. You simply have to focus on what the interviewer is asking you. Turn off the applications, all other applications on your computer or your phone so that you have less distraction. Silence the cell phone if you can so that nothing rings, but ideally try and use the computer because you'll have more control if you're using the computer. Do have a mock interview. Try and organize one with a friend. So if you know that the interview is going to be held on a Teams platform or a Zoom platform, try and organize a meeting with that person and have them interview you so you get a sense of what you might be dealing with, especially if you haven't dealt with an online interview before. And do get familiar with the platform that you're going to be using, whether it's Zoom, Teams, or Skype. Whatever you're going to be using, try and get familiar with that so that you do know what its functions are and how you can actually use it comfortably in the actual interview. Background, try and go for a neutral background. And you don't want a noisy background. You want something that projects you in a positive light and in a very professional way. So a neutral background that's not too funky, not too noisy, not too busy is usually a good idea. And in the interview itself, try not to focus too much on how you look. I think your focus should be on the camera and on the interviewer so that you don't actually miss out on any visual cues that you might actually be able to pick up. It's not yourself that you need to look at. That's something that they have to do, the interview panel. You simply have to know that you're neat, presentable, and that your picture is your face and your shoulders are captured reasonably well. And beyond that, I think you need to focus on the interviewers. And try to sit in a position that projects your face in a reasonable amount of light. And the reason I say this is if you have a light shining from behind, you're going to look very dark in the image that the interviewer actually sees. So do have a light source shining on your face, whether it's artificial or natural. Ideally, if it's natural, it's going to look better. Not very bright sunshine, but you do want to actually project a picture of yourself that's easy to see and that the interviewer can relate to. During the actual interview, like I said, look professional, dress professional. Sit upright, that's very important. Don't slouch. If you are going to be sitting in an online or a virtual interview, don't sit on the couch or in a very restful armchair. Try and sit in a chair that allows you to sit upright and try and maintain that posture throughout the interview. Good eye contact. In this case, you don't obviously have individuals that you can look at, but you do need to see that every time you want to talk to somebody or look at somebody, you need to look at the camera on your computer. We've talked about body language and that you need to sit upright. So you do want to give the sense that you're giving your fullest attention to this interview. And at the same time, I think you want to be in a reasonably relaxed, not a slouched, but a reasonably relaxed position, and that you are actually quite comfortable. This issue of the device being stable and well placed is very important. I think if you're not in a good seating position, the device is going to be very unstable and it's going to be moving around a lot. So you don't want to hold it in your hands. You want to be talking to a device or to people through a device that is very stable. And as with all interviews, they're very stressful. You get anxious before then. So by the end of the interview, thank the panel for the interview. And if you want, you may ask them when they will get back to you. In most instances, though, a skilled and experienced interviewee will actually tell you when they will respond to your application or let you know what the outcome is. And it's a good idea to debrief the interview with a friend, give a sense of how you felt, what you found was challenging, where you excelled, and what you might perhaps want to do differently. And as with all jobs that are well done, I think give yourself a treat and know that you've actually earned it. That's the end of the presentation from me. So I think we can open up for Q&A now. Tombi, do you have those questions?
All right, thank you so much to Mr. Naran for that informative session. And as a pre-final year student, I've learned so much, and I'll definitely use all that information as I apply for jobs next year. And I think the slide that I'll be holding on to the most is the self-describing word slide, because I always freeze when someone asks me to describe myself. So that was very helpful. We do have one question from anonymous attendee, and he or she is asking, what is an appropriate number of questions to ask the interviewer?
I would think possibly 2 questions. And if they prompt you or pressurize you asking more, you may have to ask more. But generally, 1 or 2 questions seems to be a standard number of questions for an interview. And I gather this from what I've read and also the number of real life interviews that I've actually participated in. I've actually interviewed candidates. So 1 or 2 questions seems to be fine.
All right, I hope that that question was answered, anonymous attendee. We also have another question from Noni Mulea, and she's asking, is it okay to take notes during an interview?
There's nothing wrong with that, but don't be so obsessed with taking notes. If you do end up having to take lots of notes, what's going to happen is that you're going to be distracted and you're not going to be focusing on the interview panel and the questions that they actually ask you. So notes, yes, but do not make the interview about a session in which you are constantly taking notes. Try and trust yourself to be able to listen to a question and respond to it in a reasonable way.
I think that you really broke down everything so well, Mr. Naran, and filled in all the gaps to a point where you answered all the internal questions that we had. I'm going to take one last question, and this is from Azra Raja. I'm sorry if I mispronounced your surname. A question I have difficulty answering is, what type of remuneration are you expecting, or what type of salary as someone really going into the workspace? And how does one answer this question?
It's always a difficult thing, I think, to deal with that question. Generally, though, if it's a new candidate, a new graduate, they don't usually discuss salary in the interview these days, okay? But that does not mean that you shouldn't be prepared. So I think try and get in touch with a couple of people who've entered the world of work and get a sense of what they're being paid. So if I were to be asked that question, what salary are you expecting? I would first of all give the indication that my interest is really to get experience and to undergo growth. And I feel that the organization and this position is likely to give that to me. And I am quite negotiable around the salary. And if you are pushed, you could always say that you expect to be paid a market-related salary. And if they do push you further, I think to say, could you be more specific? Then I think do have a ballpark figure in mind, but always indicate that you are negotiable around this. Generally, though, they would interview you. They would interview a few candidates. They would obviously decide, well, 1 or 2 of them are the serious people that they want to employ. And then they would start the negotiation process.
All right, thank you so much. I hope that that question was answered, Azra. There are no further questions. I'd just like to say thank you so much for joining us, Mr. Naran, and to all our attendees. And we hope that you have acquired valuable knowledge and will use it in your virtual interviews. Thank you so much, Mr. Naran. To all our attendees.
There's just one comment that I want to make. The presentation that I use, the PowerPoint presentation, is available to Wits students. It's on Sakai. There is a worksite called Journey to Employability. and you can access the presentation there.
All right, thank you so much for that. And to all our attendees, please do not forget to join us tomorrow on Instagram Live at 6:30 p.m. on Golden Key Wits' Instagram page for day 3 of the Graduating into a Global Recession and Pandemic Work Readiness week-long event, where we will be talking about the transition from university to the workspace with Tumisang Serumola. She'll be sharing her personal experiences with graduate unemployment and giving us tips to deal with it. We look forward to seeing you tomorrow, and have a good night. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye, everyone.